All right. Very good afternoon. Welcome to our fourth session for our the eBKF8, and this is our keynote number 3, which will be presented by Jason Geton Hadi, Lord Medway. He has given a clubbit name Agantadun for his work in Barrio. Jason is not foreign to Malaysia. In fact, he was born in Malaysia and left Malaysia when he was 2 years old to go back to the UK, and did his primary and secondary level school in England, and after that went to University of Oxford for his basic degree. And Jason is, I don't know how to describe him. He wears too many hats, and he's an artist. He's a zoologist. He's a farmer. He's a pioneer in many sense, and he has started some food celebration in England at his farm in Suffolk, and also quite instrumental in getting the Barrio Food Cultural Festival, which started in Barrio about 13 years ago. So today it's an honor to have Jason to give us the keynote. And in fact, his dad, Lord Cranbrook, gave us the keynote last year at the eBKF7 in Long Bawan, which was also equally very interesting. And Jason has done, I've seen his work in England and witnessed some of the things he has done in his own communities, community in Suffolk or in different parts of England, engaging with local communities, local farmers. And then actually it was through looking at what he was doing that I realized that communities all over the world, regardless of where they are, whether in the West and the South, sometimes we often just what they call it, put these two West and East in opposition to one another. And then actually when you go down to the ground and work with people, local people, families, and local institutions, actually they bear so much similarities and they deal with similar issues in different places, perhaps maybe in different ways, but the mechanics or the mechanisms are quite the same, and there's so much to learn from one another. So today Jason is going to present to us learning from the ages. I think although he wasn't here at the keynote yesterday, there's so much thing that we can learn from both keynotes here. And learning from the ages, he calls it Gotong Royong, basically to describe what he has learned through his engagement with the clubbit in Barrio. And I think I won't say too much about the abstract. I will leave it to him to say more. So over to you, Jason.
Pauline, thank you so much. It feels a great honor to be able to join you today. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's lovely to be able to join you remotely, particularly at this time. I have very fond memories of working in Sarawak. And the theme I've chosen today, Gotong Royong, was to highlight that sense of communal action. It was a phrase I wasn't aware of before visiting Sarawak and working in the Highlands. And that sense of communal, deliberate, careful, targeted or directed communal action with a sense of broader communal engagement was very novel, coming from, I guess, a society in the UK which more emphasis is placed upon the individual. And I've called it also learning from the edges because my sense upon arrival in Sarawak and then flying from the coast to Barrio in 2005 was that the community was vulnerable to feeling quite remote and marginal. But as I came to work and share experiences with friends in the community there, my sense that self-understanding of being remote or marginal was actually misplaced. And we get a much more powerful understanding of ourselves and the world in which we live if we treat where we are as being central. And that seemed particularly relevant as a visitor to Sarawak and the Kelabit Highlands, that the daily experiences of living in an area which was called conventionally remote, with lower levels of infrastructure and energy provision and communication technologies and transport facilities, placed a much greater responsibility on the individual and on communities to manage their own development, to have self-agency. And that was very inspiring. And I guess the relative absence of some infrastructure and some resources and some facilities placed a much sharper focus on the community's work and its decision-making processes, because there were sharper edges. There was a bigger fall-off, as it were. And as a visitor, it became very clear that the capabilities of the community were really striking, and also that they are living in a landscape which was one of the few surviving landscapes in Sarawak at the time, which was largely traditionally farmed and forested still. And that meant that the community's knowledge was still intricately linked to the semi-natural and farmed environment in which it had grown over decades or centuries. And I found that very fascinating, that if one regarded the broader, the surrounding knowledge or information in a broad sense, so it could be biological information in biodiversity, it could be landscape information in the form of topography, it could be cultural information in the form of cultural monuments or traditional handicrafts or traditional forms of cultural heritage. When those are all intimately interlinked, it seemed to me you have a very, very valuable asset or resource base. And if those links are protected, the knowledge interconnecting them can become a very valuable asset for an entrepreneurial form of development, in which communities can work with their traditional knowledge in new ways. That's a preamble. I wanted to sort of step back and say hello to everyone to introduce myself, who am I, and where am I at this time, which feels relevant because I'm in a different time frame here. The outdoors, my backdrop is rather dark, and it's a lot darker beyond that outside in the landscape here. And what am I doing here today with you, as providing a keynote speech, and more broadly? As Pauline said, in terms of who am I was very fortunate to be born in West Malaysia, in a place called Gombak, just north of Kuala Lumpur, in a research station my father had created there with the University of Malaya. Where am I now is at the upper reaches of a small river system in East Suffolk, in the bit of England which sticks out above London. It looks a bit like a head. And I'm on a river which starts about 3 miles upstream of my farm. The river here is my boundary, and it flows about 20 miles downstream at a very slow incline. The river here on an August midsummer time, if you look at it, it's sometimes difficult to see which way it's flowing. Very different from the rivers in the Highlands. And when I was returned here as an adult, my mother was working with local food research and campaigning, particularly around the impact of big superstores on the economies of rural areas. And she had noted that large superstore developments could have a very, very high impact on the diversity and the economic diversity and success of local food economies. My observation was that the local food economy here was made up of many small, independently owned family businesses with no collective identity, which placed a huge vulnerability on them. They had no communal identity and no communal voice. And it's very hard to rally around them as a cause, because they were disparate in the face of a very, very large scale developer, a superstore company. on the back of my mother's research, my thought was, in faced with that kind of challenge in development, when you have diversified local voices with small independent power or authority, your position can be greatly enhanced if you have a single unifier. And working in this area, my sense was that a geographic indicator would be very powerful. That the river system which I live had no general identity, it was just local rivers. And I coined the phrase the Old Valley, which defined the river system in which I'm living. And when I first coined that, many people said, well, what is the Old Valley? Because we don't have hills. If any of you have been to the east of England, what we call a hill in Suffolk rises about 20 feet above where you happen to be standing. And I've even worked with a sheep farmer here shearing my flock. I live on a sheep farm and run food and arts events here. Looked across the field and said, I can see your rams at the top of that hill. And it was a small field which was 2 meters above where we were standing. And I thought, well, there's a Suffolk man talking. But it meant that the notion of this being a valley topographically made little sense. But in terms of identity, it made huge sense. And it allowed me to bring together all the different food businesses in this area and define them as living and working within the catchment area of the River Ord and in the Ord Valley. And that led me to start a series of events called the Ord Valley Food Adventures, the intention of which was to build identity and reputational capacity around this very diverse local food economy. And the next step was to create a food festival. It was curiously moving on to do from where I am at this moment to what I'm doing. At this time, I'm working across a sort of basket of interests, which embraces food, farming, landscape, and the arts, and treating those as key threads of development and community-based or landscape-rooted development. To give an introduction as how I came to be in Barrio, it was at the guest of Pauline through family connections. And I happened to be traveling with a sheaf of documents, which I was using to work on here in the UK, these Old Valley food adventures, which were roving around this landscape and commissioning food events to celebrate the wealth of local foods. And I happened to sit on the little cafe beside the airstrip at Barrio with John Tarraway, who asked me what I did, having previously said that he thought artists were incredibly unreliable people, which I quickly learned was my yardstick of being tested within the community to see what my sense of humor levels were like. And I confessed I was an artist and probably quite unreliable as well. But we went on to discuss what I was doing there, and I showed John these documents. And his response was, well, maybe we could do this here. And for me, I was traveling with those to do planning whilst in Sarawak for an event in the UK. But it became clear that in the Kelabit Highlands, were all the things, the model of development I was working with were present. One was a very, very strong geographic indicator. The Highlands were self-defined in many ways, very clearly. Geographically, they were defined by their conventional terms, their remoteness. It was an elevated plateau ringed by a horseshoe of forested mountains. And it was a very large, extensive catchment area of several rivers. And that instantly gave it a very, very clear sort of human, heartfelt identity. You could stand in it and look at this horseshoe of mountaintops and be beside a nearby river or stream, and you could sense in which way all the water was flowing, which way it was going, and where the settlements were and why they were there. It had an immense geographical integrity. In talking to others, it was very clear that it had a very distinct cultural identity as well. And that was breathtakingly revealed by the work of the community and researchers from Cambridge University and other universities who were revealing this extraordinary map of cultural monuments, which as a visitor seemed quite mind-blowing. It felt rather like the Angkor Wat of Borneo, but in a very subtle way, that there weren't very large single monuments, but in fact what you were looking at was a landscape which had been intimately lived in for centuries. And if you put on a discerning eye or discerning pair of spectacles, you could see that the landscape was in fact a matrix and telling a story of many centuries of past land use and current land use. And this became very clear in exploring the landscape with friends and with Pauline and your colleagues. And I recognize some of the names on the panel today and people's faces, and it's lovely to see you all here. It was very striking to walk through very remote parts of the forest and walk past lines of jackfruit trees and to realize those were the remains of someone's farm, or to find a small clearing of secondary forest near the Indonesian border and find that someone had moved from there only a few decades previously. That what to an untrained eye looked like green forest with villages dotted around it was actually a landscape telling its own story of being deeply inhabited for centuries, and that the community who are living there, their presence was woven into this landscape in a very rich and detailed way. So there was a geographic identity which was geographical and topographical and cultural through the cultural monuments, providing a sense of history. So there was depth there. What was most extraordinary as a visitor also was the breadth and variety of indigenous foods. And because of my own interest in wanting to start a food festival in the UK and using a geographic identifier of a river system as the key indicator or the key handle, as it were, I became very fascinated. And the other aspect which ticked the box as a strong geographic indicator was a very strong cultural heritage. And my primary interest was foods, but it was really apparent that it wasn't just foods which were part of the cultural heritage of the Highlands. It was the cultural monuments, the intimacy of the long-term existence, the community within the landscape, this interplay. And the third factor, which I was looking for in this model I was working with, was a vulnerability. And at home in the UK, the vulnerability was large-scale food retailers, superstores moving into a territory. In Barrow and the Connecticut Highlands, as a visitor, it became clear that there was a huge vulnerability to the loss of assets to logging. And I was very intrigued at exploring the true value of the landscape over and above or separate from the possible value of timber. And it began to seem like the landscape was a bit like the Bodleian Library. I'd not used enough at university, but it is one of the world's great repositories of written information. This was a living landscape, and it was a repository for a huge quantity of information, which the community had themselves developed over centuries, decades and centuries. And so the three variables I was looking at for the model of development I was working with in the UK were really clear in the Connecticut Highlands. And one of my aims had been to test the model I was working with in the UK to see how portable it was, to see if it was transferable and replicable. And John's statement that I think we could do this here felt like a very nice trapdoor opening, or possibly in a plane. It was that we had a good parachute with these methodologies. And from my interest, it became an opportunity to test the model I was working with at home in another location on another part of the planet. And the methodology I was using also had wrapped within it a set of sustainability criteria, which I had researched and developed in the UK, excuse me, in response to, oddly, a large-scale renewable energy development in the local landscape, which was for wind power. And I had been a great proponent of renewable energy, but found myself opposing a project and challenged myself as to why. And the reasons I felt opposed to it was the scale of the turbines being proposed at 100 meters felt very disproportionate to our landscape setting in the village in which I live, in which our largest structure otherwise is our medieval church, which had a tower of 13 meters. And putting 100-meter tall turbines within 800 meters of that, or kilometers, seemed disproportionate. The chain of ownership was very curious. It was owned by a development vehicle incorporated in the Marshall Islands, owned by a parent company incorporated in the Bahamas. And that for me felt odd for a renewable energy project, which I had always imagined renewable energy would deposit ownership and benefit back into communities and into the landscape in which it's rooted, because it's a communal resource to some extent, the sunshine or the wind which blows overhead. And it seemed actually inversely quite an achievement to develop a wind resource and actually deposit the costs locally and extract the benefit and place those offshore. And the range of sustainability criteria I developed were in response to all these variables which felt somehow wrong. And they were based also on an observation that we, in so many different circumstances around the world, are all talking about sustainable development. But it can mean different things to different people according to the immediate scenario we're working within. So if I'm building a high performance racing car, for me, sustainability might be about improving tire performance to reduce fuel consumption. And I could say that's towards sustainability. But someone else might look at that and say, well, racing cars with hydrocarbon fuels is not sustainable in itself at all. And that's a rather extreme example, but it seemed like we were all using the same phrase, but it had no bottom to it anymore. So the idea of the sustainability criteria I developed was to try and create a set of rules or metrics that if you applied them to any decision-making process in any context, in any sector, they would guide you towards outcomes which were genuinely sustainable. And I would call it a sort of contributive approach to economics, or to coin a phrase, contributive economics. And it's about systems enrichment. And the metrics you measure are enrichment across biological information, knowledge gain, income redistribution, and so on. There's 7 in all. And I'd identified renewable energy and ICTs as key variables to add in the mix.
Excuse me, Jason.
Yeah.
Would you like us now to put the PowerPoint or? Please
do. Yes. Yeah. I think the risk, otherwise I'm just going to keep talking.
No, I think it's very good what you're saying. Tim, would you? Yeah, thank you.
So if I start, I've kept the PowerPoint relatively short. It's five pages, and it was to illustrate some of the key points I've already introduced, which for me feel like developmental issues. So as we start on this image, learning from the edges, I've touched upon that already, the sense that actually what is a very challenging time for us all globally at the moment, we probably have much to gain and much to learn if we treat communities who it is easy to regard as marginal or remote or peripheral to where the main bulk of development is actually happening as key sources of information, because they are at the edges and they have a different perspective. They're looking outward and very often into wilder or natural, semi-natural habitats, which we've lost in many other parts of the world, and also have retained or have stronger value systems. So learning from the edges is, who are you? And I've explained a bit who am I, and what am I doing, but also what are we doing, and where are we going? Because as I come a little bit later in the talk, the real questions facing us today, I think, as essentially as a global community. And it's important, I feel, to see ourselves as a global community, not as an increasingly fractured and fractious collection of entities, individuals or regions within nations or nations in competition with each other. So where are we going? The images, sorry, bottom top right is where I'm sitting at the moment, is in that that white farmhouse. And that's my farm in the Upper All Valley in this catchment area. And bottom left is a photograph landing in the highlands in the catchment area of the Sungai Dapur and the Kelapang River. Bottom right is a view from some research trips I did 4 and 5 years ago to Long Son, Long Aka, lower down on the Baram. And to drop into the conversation, I think it's really important to see the Kelabit Highlands and eBarrio and what has been happening there as being at the crown, as it were, the headwaters of this mighty river. And the Baram, for me as a visitor, seems to be one of the great rivers of Asia, and its status needs to be acknowledged in that sense. I think it weaves together communities all along its length with shared and distinct cultural heritage. So for me, to visit bottom left barrier was traveling afar, and I learned from being in the community that the notion of traveling afar and gaining knowledge and experience and wealth, be it in understanding or material goods, was part of the community's value framework. I also came to realize, both here in Suffolk and in Barrow and the Kelabit Highlands, that words are a currency. The words we choose to use and spend have great significance in our lives and impact as well. And moving on that action, if we are operating with a values framework which is consistent or is engineered in a way to deliver sustainable development, the words we're using within that framework will have greater depth and meaning and will ideally reach people better. And it will allow us, the combination of those two, our values framework and the words we are using, to translate those into deliberate actions using the resources which are around us. A knowledge exchange will come to over the coming pages, and that has been a vital experience of my traveling afar between Suffolk and Sarawak. And the middle central picture at the top represents that notion of traveling. And that's the view from where I'm sitting at the moment when the sun rises. And for me, it's the view into the Pulong, the forest at the top of the hill on my farm. And that's a grove of chestnut trees, which in the Highlands, I was very surprised to find the Buat Barangan, which is a kind of an equivalent. And that grove of chestnut trees, for me, represents my little patch of wild forest in this landscape. Thank you. We could move on to the second slide, please. So I mentioned the set of sustainability criteria, and that these emerged from 4 observations. One was that the term sustainable development and sustainability were being used so broadly and so thinly that their meaning was beginning to be eroded. The second observation was that in the absence of some form of universal set of sustainability criteria, which could be used across, for example, all government departments or different aspects of local, national and private planning processes, you could bump into contradictions, or you could be talking about what you felt were the same thing, but in fact was not, which would lead to mismatches or misunderstandings. My third observation was, in consequence of that absence, it's also easy to duplicate resources or expenditure because we're not all talking within the same framework. And my fourth observation was that there seemed to be a great opportunity to try and create a set of criteria you could work for sustainable development and apply, sort of drop into any scenario. And that the greatest importance was not so much rooted in new technologies or new scientific developments, but actually in the values, the value framework within which we choose to use them and how we choose to use them. So next slide, please. So again, this is the images show the beautiful landscape of the Kelabit Highlands, top and bottom, and the very adventurous form of arrival by plane. The middle photograph shows something here. I built a table, a picnic table, which is 200 meters long on my farm out of oak. It was intended to be the longest picnic table on the planet. And we were unofficially for about 4 months, but not officially because we weren't a commercially available design of table. But the idea of that was to create a table so long that it could be seen from space at which to eat foods from the Ord Valley, this landscape. So it was to sort of bang a drum, as it were. And the two landscapes I've been working with on food festivals. The sustainability criteria, these are the 7 criteria which are not definitive, and they do overlap to some extent, and I also welcome critique of them. And they're based upon my response to what I saw as quite a skewed renewable energy development. So one is proportionality and sensitive to setting, that if a development's to be considered sustainable, it needs to be integrated within local social, economic, and environmental surroundings and proportionate to them and interconnected to them if it's to bring longer term local social and economic gain. The second was that for developments to be sustainable, they must be protecting natural heritage or landscape assets because these are rare, and in my own experience, the quality and identity of a landscape should be treated actually as an anchor to all development. It's a primary foundational asset, and we should not erode that. And that became very apparent to me in arriving in the Kelabit Highlands, that the quality of the landscape there within which the community were living was an extraordinary primary asset base and something to be protected in order to facilitate much greater long-term economic gain. Distributed ownership of technologies, that if ownership is pushed out, that again is more equitable and can have a transformative effect upon local, regional, and national economies. The provision of local social, economic, and environmental enrichment. Again, that's a slight duplication, but if this rule is applied, the blanket effect of development is that you have universal and widely distributed gain. And that point, I guess, is directed as a counterpoint to something we're experiencing more and more, which is offsetting, or the idea that you can do a bit of damage locally if you pay for something nice to be done elsewhere, which logically doesn't work if you pursue it to its total exclusion, because the risk is that you damage more and more areas and improve a smaller or shrinking sort of land asset. 5, the provision of skilled local employment and resource use, so that there are developments which provide ongoing local employment and access to and ownership of resource use, bring economic gain directly back into local communities. And that's linked to the equitable distribution or redistribution of income from the use of local assets and local resources. And the 7th was provision of significant local ecological gain, that developments should show on-site ecological enrichment. So if you look at those, when sitting by the tarmac with John Taraway in the Kelabit Highlands and looking at the landscape around me, it was apparent that there was an extraordinary opportunity to try and work with these criteria on a model of development which celebrated the cultural heritage using the landscape of the Kelabit Highlands as a geographic identifier, and sought to be a buffer against large-scale incoming development activities. And also, you'll note too, I've mentioned ICTs, information communication technologies, and renewable energy technologies. they seem to be key liberators, or key parts of the mix. And what I found very extraordinary in being in the Connecticut Highlands at that time was the presence of eBarrio, and seeing how that was dramatically bringing in access to ICTs and was using renewable energy to power itself partly. And again, it was clear that in providing direct internet access to the community in that area, when more conventional means of communication or transport, road access at that time, or wide-scale telephone use were not present, it was very dramatic to see the impact of the internet centre. Most strikingly, I felt, was in the tourism sector, that it allowed local families and local individuals to present and establish themselves as homestay owners or forest guides direct to their customer base, either domestically or internationally, which meant that almost all the income from tourism was going directly into the local community. And that seemed very different from other places I'd visited. And eBarrio was also, as a visitor, was potentially allowing me to communicate with the community remotely. Next slide, please. So as I spent more time in the Connecticut Highlands, and there was a decision with John and Pauline and others, key people leading and assisting, the first food festival happened. I remember having a phone call from John about 3 months before it saying, I don't know what we're doing, but it's going to happen. And partly because I think a lot of the indigenous foods in the area were daily foods, and perhaps not so exciting to people living in the Highlands, but as a visitor, they were truly extraordinary. And the breadth and variety of indigenous foods and farmed, foraged and wild foods was truly exceptional. But as I spent more time there, I learned, in order to work with the aspects of the model I was hoping to bring in, a key part of the process I needed to work with was traveling afar myself, was to immerse or be subordinate to the place. And that was influenced a bit by my father and also Tom Harris's work in the sort of immersion theory, to make oneself subordinate to and of service to the place or the project. I also became very aware of values within the community of self-agency. Out of necessity, if you're living in a village which has no road access, to build a house, you need to have the abilities yourself or within the community to create all the materials you need to build a home and for it to work. And I became aware through Pauline's work and research and talking to friends there, the notion of iyuk and doortness, of goodness, and also that a strong aspect of leadership, an important quality, seemed to be to shut up and listen, which it seems in contrast to a lot of popular ideas about what it means to lead here at the moment. Through there's a big program, TV program, The Apprentice, which seemed to suggest that a form of leadership in which a slightly authoritarian or dominating form was one to aspire to. So those values within the community were very extraordinary to witness and to begin to understand and to try and learn from. And other words, as I mentioned earlier, as currency, Kuman Priyong and Gotong Royong and the welcome, Tunge, and Kerjasama too, they had a beautiful ring to them. And they were also, in very simple ways, describing processes which were quite rare in the UK. The notion of eating together, we certainly have that here. But I remember the first community Ira I visited in Barrio Asal, passing the women packing hundreds of beautiful packages of steamed rice and vegetables and palm leaves. And then we passed the men who were cooking, I think, 80 kilos of pork or meat in one frying pan and 30 kilos of chicken in another. And one frying pan was, I think, about 8 feet by 4 feet by foot deep. And this was at the heart of Keynote Royong, of cooking for very large numbers of people, in which the emphasis was on the food and the coming together to eat, the humanity of that and the sharing of food. And I was struck that the most important thing was the big frying pan and the hands and the growing of the food. And it was not on, in the UK, I was very struck thinking about it, that the emphasis would be on sets of glasses, knives and forks, cutlery, tablecloths, lots of peripheral things which actually didn't really contribute to the fact, to the act of cooking and eating together. And that those were profound lessons, and the words felt very important. And they're words that I traveled back home with to the UK. So to touch upon that, the meaning of words and picking them up and pocketing them and sharing them and reciprocal learning. From the UK, in working with the community and crucially through eBarrio and then with the Kamibu, the women's church group, Ruram Kanabit Sarawak, the elders, the Belia, the youth groups, and many others, and with much support coming from many different parts of the community. What I felt I could contribute from here was this sort of three-step model of asset protection and value release. So the first step was to identify the cultural heritage which felt at risk, the food, the forest, the monuments. The geographic identifier was the Kalabit Highlands. And the model I work with in the UK is to take a celebrational approach. And that crystallized itself as the Barrio Food Festival, or Pesta Nukanen. And then my idea was that once this was embedded, it would gain its own autonomy. My role would slip away. But the next phases would be capacity building and reputational gain through the festival surviving, and ideally using some of the sustainability criteria I'd hope to build into it as my sort of contribution, with contribution coming from many other sources too. And from Barrio, the things I picked up and brought home, and which have influenced my way of working in the UK immensely, I can't understate that, was a sense of community vision, and witnessing in Barrio this immense expertise and capability in managing events and managing development with input from other experts coming in. And as noticed, I defer to many other people on the panel who have worked in the Highlands for much longer time than I've been fortunate to. Roger, I can see you're here. And I was struck also how eBarrio was a center of knowledge and catalyst for embedded action. And it seemed to become crucial for that in its early years. And from the community, the sense of values and language, and a language which is rooted in its surroundings, and observing the integrated groups within the community who had their own purpose, but then would easily interact with each other towards communal action. And then seeing how the community also invited other agents or agencies or participants to join in with them as well. That seemed very striking. The eBorneo conference, it's very a delight to take part today, because I can see clearly how that has grown out of eBarrio and has grown out of all these things that you've been working on, which is remarkable. And it feels like a tree which has grown and is dropping fruit in many other parts of Malaysia and other parts of the world. I think there's one, just to show you briefly examples of reciprocal learning. The top photograph is a launch at Pesta Nukanen, I think in 2018, with some freshly cooked labo being presented to Datuk Ose Murang. the bottom is my own recent attempt at that. Or we cook on an open hearth in the barns here on my farm, and this was cooking mutton for some guests a few weeks ago. It's my little tatal, my hearth on the farm. And the middle photograph shows one of the art studios we have in the woods here, which was very much inspired by the design of the small granaries on the farmsteads in Barrow and the Collabic Highlands. And that we call that the Wildwood Residency Hut, and that supports various artists whilst they're here. I think there's one more slide. So to round up and round off, for me at this time, there's been a very big question of where are we going? What values am I taking, or what values are we taking as a global community going forwards? And therefore also what words we're using. In my own personal life, my business model here on my farm was organizing large seasonal public arts festivals. That was a business model which just evaporated completely last March, which was quite dramatic. It's something I've been building up for 17 years. So that's involved a lot of regrouping. And the way we're doing that is to create a large number of residencies for artists and makers embedded within the landscape of the farm, looking at conservation projects or rebirding the landscape, restoring hedgerows, building up a collection of flowering cherry trees, working with natural plants and dyes and wool from the farm. So we currently have about 12 residencies in action, and we're building up to about 20 or 30, so that the farm effectively becomes an art farm in which much of the productivity is in the form of the visual arts and crafts and also writing, that these are the products arising from this landscape. More broadly, and one of the delights of being able to take part today is to rekindle that sense of Gotong Royong and working together. That here in the UK through COVID, as our sources of information have become, I guess, more personalized or diversified through social media, there is, I think, a sense that we have become more fractured and multipolar or multi-oriented in the way we look at things. And I touched upon the theme of Gotong Royong because it feels so powerful and so important as a word or phrase, and for all that it means, and invites us to work together, and to do that to develop shared values or value frameworks, which I would hope are truly sustainable or rooted in the landscape and rooted in communities, and at risk of sounding more emotional than empirical, which is probably a good thing, more heartfelt and more rooted in compassion too. And I guess to sum up, my experience of working in the Highlands and working with eBarrio and the community is that the value systems operating within the community I found deeply inspiring, and they have informed the way in which I operate here. And I open my farm to people with a sense of welcome, of tunge, come and eat together, kuman priyong. Welcome them to this farm and to the arts festivals. So the take-home lesson for me is to work with the continue to work with the methodologies that we've been exploring here, which have been deeply interwoven and influenced by working in Sarawak and with eBarrio and the community in the Collabic Highlands, and to continue to forge those links across borders and to promote knowledge exchange and collaboration. And that, again, to touch base, is why it's so nice to be able to take part today. And the photographs on this page show a land residency. Top left, we're working with an artist following one field on the farm for 12 months through the visual arts, through painting. Top right is Lian Labang at the festival in Barrio, I think in 2018 when I was last there. The picture below is from a rebirding residency on the farm, in which we are undertaking a raft of conservation measures to improve the farm for bird life, and have invited an artist to record every species of bird on the farm. And the bottom right is a residency we've just launched with an artist or craft worker exploring natural dyes, and we're linking that with a residency looking at the seasonal flowering of cherry trees on the farm. So she's creating silk scarves dyed and printed with leaves and bark from the farm. Those just give a tiny glimpse of the model of working here, which again is learning from Barrio and learning from Sarawak, of seeing the beautiful crafts, which again come out and emerge from the farms and the forests in Sarawak. And in being outward looking, we sent an invitation today to some recent new friends from Nepal, and at the farm here we're linking up the University of East Anglia to offer residencies for their 2 international chairs of writing. I hope our first writing residence will be someone called John Bangan from the Philippines. So we're at the farm here, I'm aspiring for this small farm in the Upper Ould Valley to become a little tiny global hub of knowledge exchange, and sort of cultural values and shared learning, which again, Sarawak has been such an important part of that for me, that shared learning, that it feels a great honor and privilege and delight to take part in the conference today. Bridging darkness to dawn. You might even be able to hear a cockerel crowing in the background. So I think I'm conscious of time.
Thank you.
We're approaching my limit, I think.
Thank you. Tim, can you pull down the PowerPoint, please? Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much for that very inspiring and comprehensive presentation, infusing with your experience working here in Sarawak. So we have about 7 minutes to 3 o'clock, and there'll be a break before the next session. Anyone has a burning question for Jason? No. A lot to think about. You can put your question below. Roger?
Yeah, can I offer observation? First of all, Jason, wonderful to see you. It's been a while. And thanks for such erudite presentation. I guarantee I'm going to use some of your comments in future talks, because you have a beautiful way of putting across emotions that I think all of us foreigners coming into Barrio feel in one way or another. And it's interesting because many of your comments kind of converged with my own thoughts, and even those of our keynote speaker yesterday, Professor Tim Unwin. And it seems that foreigners coming into Barrio and the Highlands, maybe initially before we arrive, we have an idea that we have something to contribute, however modest it might be. But we all seem to come away with the balance of contribution in the other direction. We learn more than we impart. And I get that sense from you, certainly from myself, and I think from Prof. Unwin yesterday. Learning more about community values, sustainable living, and well-being as a yardstick of progress rather than economic development. And it's interesting from our point of view. I think we see those characteristics becoming more and more relevant in days of sustainable development goals, climate change, and the need to preserve biodiversity. So again, it really harmonizes with the idea of, as Pauline and I put it recently in a paper, coming from the margins into the mainstream. So, but without making a big speech about it, I was just interested, you mentioned the value of landscapes and also put it into the context of wind turbines, which is exactly what our keynote speaker did yesterday. So a bit of a coincidence there. But there's obviously something happening here. And when we talk about value, there's usually a value has a value. It might be numerical or it might not be, but it has some rating system that assigns it as high or low. Is there any way we can apply that to a landscape? I mean, not just the view that you see from a camera, but what's on that view and within the wider context, as you say, so eloquently put it, a horseshoe of mountains and the whole Barham river system. Is there some way that can be expressed without it being totally emotional and personal and subjective? Because that seems to be getting more and more important as these debates continue.
I guess that you could approach it from the edges, and my one intention of mine or hope in working with the community and yourself and others on Pesta-Nukunen, the food festival, was to try and nurture or create a festival which had such strong identity and demonstrated such strong earnings capacity within a short period of time that you could begin to move the value of that sideways into the landscape, because Barrio Food Festival Pesta-Nukunen, it celebrates the semi-intact sort of traditional farmed and forested landscape. So there the idea was that, say, if you went back to 2018 or 2019 and assayed or tried to work out how much income was being generated over those 3 days to stall holders, whole villages, homestay owners, transport owners, guides, you'd get a peripheral perspective on its value, but that would be only a fraction. I think if you looked at all, you'd get an impression by looking at all the things which the landscape and the integrity of that landscape supports, which would be the tourism economy, the food economy, the farming economy, the Pesta-Nukunen's income, and that would tell you a bit about what it's doing. In terms of valuing it itself, my impression here, or my sort of modus operandi, is that we should treat our landscape assets as foundational assets, that we should seek never to weaken their character or quality, and always to protect it or enhance it or work within its qualities, in whatever form of development we're proposing, even if it's industrial. That because if we treat it as a foundational core asset, sort of baseline, it provides identity, and therefore, if we protect it, my view is that a landscape that has high visual amenity and ecological value and cultural value, if you treat that as something which you don't disturb, it can be the most extraordinary asset multiplier to any other business or activity or enterprise you choose to place within it. And that was, again, a strong reason for wanting to work in the Highlands. It seemed a semi-pristine, sort of traditionally farmed and forested landscape. And if that could be protected, the earnings capacity for the community seemed absolutely enormous, because you would be allowing traditional knowledge, which would touch upon the use of different plants or different physical materials, the knowledge of the landscape in terms of facilitating access for tourism, or sort of cultural development. It would treat all of those in being locally owned as the means to earn income as well. So I'm slightly dodging your question, because I wouldn't really know how to value it, except to, in a slightly random way, say it should be at least 10 times the value of any sort of crude economic value you put on it. So in the Highlands, if you value the timber at so much, in the forest you should arbitrarily say, well, I think the landscape itself in an intact state would be 10, 20, 100 times the value of that. And that was my concern to share, I guess, publicly, was I saw the risk of logging coming fully into the highlands would work strongly against that asset value and would begin to disrupt or dismantle the integrity of that landscape and the linkage between the cultural monuments, the food heritage, the landscape heritage, and the community living within it. And that if you begin to disrupt or break that linkage, you begin to force people to become units of labor rather than entrepreneurs within their own knowledge settings. So I think that's why I was excuse me, very interested to see eBarrier and the work of yourselves and others, was that it was also working ways in which it was treating that linkage of local knowledge and the broader landscape, the cultural landscape. If you preserve that linkage, it allows people to become entrepreneurs rather than laborers. And that to me, if you protect that linkage, you can actually support really transformative economic development, because everyone becomes the author of their own economic destiny, and they can be imaginative as well. And one of the pleasures in going to Pesta 3 years ago now was seeing the emergence of local micro brands of indigenous foods or foods from the highlands, which was always a hope that Pesta could be an umbrella or a sort of mother goose, as it were, to support or incubate the appearance of local foods, because as a festival, it could promote the identity of the highlands as a place in which indigenous foods were very present and celebrated, and as a standalone event in the year, it could promote the highlands as a source of more sustainable foods or indigenous foods as businesses, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're coming to end of this session, and there is a very interesting question here. Actually, can these Gotong Royong observations be put or adapted into a commercialized setting? Example, collectivist spirit being put into a highland industry development. That's a good question. You have 1 minute to answer, and then that's it. Yeah.
Yes. But I think, again, a key aspect of what I've been discussing and what I found really important to emphasize is that the form of development we're talking about is ground up. It's giving people room and the freedom to discuss and decide the trajectory of their development themselves. And that is something I realized really opened my eyes in the Highlands too, was seeing a community discussing development trajectories within their value framework. So I think Gotong Royong could work within more commercialized settings, but I would guess make a little footnote that maybe the whole approach of Gotong Royong should be beginning to upset our notions of what ordinary commercial activity is, that we should be doing business in different ways.
Right. Right. With that, thank you very much once again, Jason, for very interesting. I don't have a word. Roger has a beautiful way to explain how the presentation went, but it was really, really good. Thank you very much. And thank you to all that to those who attend. I can see that in Kit Pierce here, and I can see Sina Dara from Miri coming to join, and Lian from Barrio, and Diana also is here. We can see that. We can see them. John is here. So yeah, so you do have support from Valerie is also here with us. So thank you, everyone. for being here. And I know Raban is watching you. Lawai just sent me a picture, and Raban is listening. David Labang is basically listening in to you.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I've got my little backdrop of a backpack from Pat Longan and a Kalang basket. So I'm trying to pretend at least I'm in Sarawak.
Thank you once again. Thank you for tuning in from England. I know
my pleasure. Thank you so much, and it's a great honour to be able to take part today. And I wish you well. I'll try and duck into proceedings later, but thank you. It's really exciting to be able to take part.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to ICT. Oh, Pretty. Oh, we see. Oh, your friend from Nepal also tuned in. Pretty.
Oh,
precious. Yeah. We welcome you, Pretty. Thank you so much for tuning in from Nepal. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. All right, over to ICT.